You ready to get started on some reef aquarium misconceptions?
Let's do it. This will be a fun one.
It'll be a fun one because for like 10 to 15 to 20 years, I'm like, no, that's not true. That's not true. And there's definitely a lot of things people think they know about the reef aquarium hobby that they want to believe. They want to believe that this bottle of miracle cure is going to be the silver bullet. They want to believe that ABC fish eats XYZ pest, and it's just not true. So the first misconception I want to bring up is that reef aquariums are hard. What do you say about that, Mark?
I think there is I mean, they'll always have their trials and tribulations, right? It's rare for your tank not to be, I don't know, you have those moments of autopilot, but you're always going to have your little battles with something. But I think it is as complicated or as hard as you make it. It's, what you choose to keep, what size it is, everything, right? And I definitely feel like if I was a newbie jumping in and, I start watching a bunch of videos and seeing people with their setups, I would, we've all been there where the non-saltwater hobbyist comes to your house and goes, oh, I've always heard those saltwater tanks are hard. And I think if you're a newbie and you saw some of the plumbing and all the gadgetry on tanks lately, you would also be under that impression because there's complexity in learning all those additional gadgets, right? A calcium reactor is not a very simple thing, right? You're putting CO2 into a semi-pressurized chamber and you're doing a drip rate and bubble, So
the funny thing about a calcium reactor is if you have a calcium reactor, you can't do anything with it. Right? You need media, you need a CO2 tank, you need a pressure regulator, you need a solenoid valve, you need a pH controller with a pH probe, maybe even a dosing pump to feed it. But we approach all those things one at a time, but if you set up a basic tank with no filter, a little bit of water flow, a heater and some light, your zoanthus are never going to give you problems.
Right.
If you set up a similar tank with just an anemone, a pair of clownfish, man, you're going to be bored with that tank. It's just going to look beautiful. You're not going to have to do anything.
And when you get bored with it, then you start diving into the more complexity of, setting up things like, I find adding this A and B solution every few days drives me kind of crazy. Oh, well, you can set up a dosing pump. Oh, what's that? Or and then you go down that path of learning the more complex intricacies of how you can, set up a saltwater aquarium further. But to your point, you don't need all of that. You could set up a great tank with some very hardy corals with very minimal effort.
And by and large, the reef aquarium hobby, 90+% of reef aquariums are trying to recreate something very unnatural, right? We're trying to keep soft corals on the left, stony corals at the top, LPS at the bottom, all kinds of fish and corals that do not come from the same environment. That's where the issues come, right? I have a dedicated euphilia tank. That thing is dialed in. All my acros, I don't try to keep any trachees or scholemias in there because that would just be so hard. So yeah, reef aquariums are definitely not hard. It's like you said, it's what you make of it. All right, how about the next one? And this is one that's, oh man, this is a whole can of worms, but the fact that before someone is instructed on how to keep a reef tank, they have to have a crash course in water purification. There's absolutely this notion that you have to have a reverse osmosis unit to have a saltwater tank.
Yeah, I think that's one of those perfect examples of people don't like to dive into the particulars, so a blanket answer is the easiest path. Where if you don't need an RO unit, it's not necessarily going to help or hurt you from where whether you treat it or not. If you have pretty good water quality, you could just get by with less. So if you take 30 people and you don't say, well, you need to dive into the particulars. Let's talk about what type of water is coming into your house. Are there any seasonal changes, this and that? That gets complicated. Whereas if you just tell everybody, yeah, you need an RO unit, whether you need it or not. It's a blanket answer, but I agree with you because it's a complex thing to deal with. It's expensive. I mean, relatively speaking.
A mid-range reverse osmosis unit could cost you as much as a basic small reef tank.
Yeah. And I said that in our last reef therapy, that I always said with nanos, in the evaporation, right? When I'm thinking of a kid getting into the hobby, it's kind of a hard sell to convince mom and dad to set up a reverse osmosis unit, I think. I mean, I'm sure plenty do, but it's a tricky sell, I think, to have to deal with that.
It's a learning curve before you can get started on your aquarium. So just for the record, you and I started out at a time when reverse osmosis units were like very specialized. They were like, very expensive, especially as a youngster, and very complicated, and you might flood and so many other things. But so I think we have a different point of view as far as like starting out with our tap water purifiers. I know we talked about this a little bit.
Yep.
But my water's pretty pure. I have 2 ppm of silicates. I have a little bit of calcium, a little bit of magnesium, and I get pulses of copper. And instead of setting up an RO unit, I just set up a bunch of carbon blocks. Almost everything you want to remove, that you really have to remove, any kind of heavy metals, carbon's going to take care of it. I know a lot of people are concerned maybe about like phosphates in your water, and okay, that might be one of those cases, but that information is widely available now on the internet. You can actually go to your specific municipality of water treatment and find out what's in your water before you get into a reverse osmosis unit.
Yeah, I mean, my pre-RO water is 20 parts per million TDS. I don't know what is in that TDS, right? I don't know what it's comprised of. I've been wanting to get it tested. My local water supply doesn't get too into the details of what's in the tap, and then there's the factor of, okay, that's the water treatment plant, but by the time it gets to my house, goes through my plumbing, what else is added. But I've always been curious to see, like, do I really need this thing, or could I get away with some carbon blocks with 20 parts per million? I do think my water's high in iron. Because of where I live, we got a lot of red clay around here.
That is the most effective way to take out iron. But the other thing with the RO is people assume that a reverse osmosis is absolute, but it works on percentages. So if you have high copper or high iron or high phosphate, you're still going to have a percentage of that getting through. And, it's like, all right, well, then you add a DI, anion, cation, mixed bed resin to after your RO, but then now you're adding a whole bunch more complexity where it's like, you could fix that with just the carbon.
Yeah, I agree. My new tank that still hasn't come yet, but I've debated, do I just fill it up with tap water? And then I've got some old RO housings, right, pre-filter housings, and I could just throw some carbon in one and throw maybe some $20 DI resin in the other and run it for a couple of days with a power head, while the tank is circulating.
That's another one that just seems like you're not really connecting the dots. When you set up a brand new tank with purified water. The whole point of a new tank, in order to get the cycle going, is you kind of need to get it dirty. You're going to be doing a lot of processing before you put anything in there. So just fill it up with tap, man. Just fill it up with tap. But it's always just sat very strangely with me that seawater is well known to have pretty much every single element on the periodic table, and we go to such great lengths to strip everything out just so we can add it back in. And I get it, maybe if you have very hard water, a lot of calcium, a lot of carbonates in your water, if you use a readily available salt mix, you might be starting out with very elevated levels, but that should be taken on a case-by-case basis, and not a blanket, you need an RO purification center.
Yeah, I mean, I think if people are willing to get into the particulars, look at what your tap water analysis looks like. Maybe evaluate if there's seasonal changes like spring runoff and stuff that maybe brings in some extra factors that you're worried about. And then make a decision based on that, but don't go on the gospel that everybody needs to purify their water, right? And that's why you see like threads online where people are like, oh, I run my tank on tap water, and it's like, oh, you're such a rebel. And it's like, well, it probably works for him. It may not work for the next person depending on their water source, but neither person is wrong, or in a bad place to set up a reef tank. You may need it, you may not. It's a decision.
That's a great point, though. You talk about seasonal changes. So, before I started up the studio, I set my water off for ICP testing a few different places. They concurred on the silicate level in my water, but none of them showed the copper. It took me a while to figure out they had a copper, and that was coming in pulses. And I don't know where it's coming from. Again, it's seasonal, it's like very intermittent, and I'm like, you know what, screw it, I'm just gonna use a ton of carbon blocks. So that works for me. All right, you got any other misconceptions? You want to take the next misconception? You got one at the top of your brain?
I've got a couple. This goes a little bit back to the naming conventions of corals, but more generic in the sense that you have these stereotypes around the care of corals, whether they're LPS, SPS, softies.
Good one.
And it drives me crazy because there are LPS softies that... Stonies, soft corals, whether the polyps are small or large, right? Like, that doesn't really dictate necessarily what environment they come from, what kind of type of situation they would thrive in. And even when you talk about soft corals, many soft corals that are considered low light, or that regard high nutrient low light, yes, they may tolerate that, but you put some of those type of softies in a high light, high flow environment, and it's a different coral. It'll thrive. It'll be... So then the question is, well, it's like, all right, which do you think it actually prefers?
That's an excellent point. The SPS and LPS, small polyp stony, large polyp stony designations came from the aquarium hobby, and it's just a generalization. Mm-hmm. And what do you do about those corals in the middle of the range? Is a Cyphastria, is that a small polyp coral, or is that a medium polyp coral? Leptoceras, I would say that's a small polyp coral, but that grows really low. And the same thing what you said about the soft corals. When you're diving the reef, you'll find a lot more soft corals in the shallows and really bright water, and then you find a good amount in mid-water. But once you get down deep, you might find a few sarcophytons, but the only soft corals down there are non-photosynthetic. Once you get down into the really low light reef, there's going to be photosynthetic stony corals, but non-photosynthetic soft corals. But that's a great point. LPS and SPS is just a loose category, very, very loose.
And you see like PAR recommendations for SPS corals and PAR recommendations for LPS corals, and I don't quite understand that. Mm-hmm. Again, I see the point of you can get away with spending less maybe in lighting and flow for certain types of corals because maybe their range of tolerance is a lot larger. Mm-hmm. But if we're in the hobby and we're trying to grow these corals as well as possible and as nicely as possible, I think throw softies in high par, right? Like that's to me, that doesn't make sense that you would make those recommendations, especially with LEDs where you're not necessarily spending less money. You have the same set of lights, but you're adjusting the values in your little app, right? Mm-hmm. And like these are the recommended values for an LPS tank, and these are the recommended. You should put your violets to this and that percentage for SPS, and it's like that makes the most sense to me. You go scuba dive, or better yet, go snorkel, because you go into a shallow environment. And I've seen lobophytums, sarcophytums in several feet of water, just right there, just getting hammered by waves.
Yeah.
And they're amazingly large and beautiful. And I'm like, well, yeah, that's, why not replicate that?
Yeah, no, that's an awesome point. I can't think of any other great examples, but SPS and LPS really just, that designation only works at the extremes. And I think candy coral is a perfect example. I've seen that coral in 3 feet of water. I've seen it on 100 feet. It grows very different, but it'll be the same strain, but it's also acclimated to those conditions. So definitely be mindful of what you think SPS and LPS means. That was a good one. I didn't have that one on my list.
I've seen tabling acros like down 100 feet, right? So